So what Marx said, rather straightforwardly, not in a way that Hegel himself would disagree with, which is that the Hegelian dialectic is a labor metaphysics. It's the metaphysics of labor. So you mentioned the phenomenology of spirit. The phenomenology of spirit is really about the proto-history of bourgeois society. It's about the stages through which bourgeois society comes to self-consciousness. It's the stages through which labor comes to self-consciousness. So one of my pet peeves in the world is the lordship and bondage section of the phenomenology of spirit, right? It's about labor. It's about labor. It's about the labor of the slave. And once the slave recognizes his or her own labor, then he reveals or she reveals her consciousness to be essential and the master's consciousness to be inessential. That is the bourgeois revolution, by the way. The only successful slave revolt in history. The bourgeois revolution is the only successful slave revolt in history. It's the only slave revolt that ended in or resulted in the abolition of slavery, rather than just some slaves escaping so that they could have slaves of their own someplace else. Right? So phenomenology of spirit is about a kind of logical and to a certain extent historical exposition of the emergence of self-consciousness as the emergence of the self-consciousness of labor. And it is a labor metaphysics. It's also an emancipation. It's also a freedom. It's a metaphysics of freedom. The problem is that metaphysics of freedom is contradicted in capitalism. Meaning, I mentioned, I think Dave asked earlier about Rousseau and the general will. Well, you could say we have a social general will of labor that is contradicted by the objective tendency of capital. We now also have looked at another way. We have a social metaphysics of labor that is contradicted by a metaphysical crisis of capital, of capitalism. So that's why Marx can think that when talking about capitalism, it's appropriate to talk metaphysically, but in a way that we're tasked with overcoming. All right, so let me just, because I know a lot of you do have interest in philosophy, just make a very simple point, which is traditional metaphysics and modern metaphysics. So traditional metaphysics is overthrown by modern metaphysics, namely Kant. Namely, a new basis in metaphysics, a new recognition of the substance of metaphysics, where it isn't external, but it's internal. It's not external to the subject, but internal to the subject. Meaning, metaphysical categories refer to us in our practical action and as members of society. It doesn't refer to the properties of things in themselves or of the world in itself. So it's an expression of our relation to the world. And how do we relate to the world in bourgeois society? Through our labor. All right, so we didn't need Marx to come along and say, oh, this is a labor metaphysics. Actually, they knew it. Actually, Rousseau talked about this too. And Kant and Hegel certainly did. So the question is how that is both true and not true in capitalism. So modern metaphysics is not traditional metaphysics because it's understanding a different basis of metaphysics, what its referent is, what its reality is. But then it's also the case that even after we recognize that metaphysics is about our action and our emancipation and our freedom, actually capitalism's contradicting that. And we get a reversion to what appears to be an external metaphysics, namely the metaphysics of capital, or an alienated metaphysics of labor. We can say that capital is the alienated metaphysics of labor that dominate us, that no longer have a substance in our struggle for freedom, but have a reality of our being dominated and being in a state of unfreedom. So that gives a kind of a curious character to the whole thing, namely, to get beyond bourgeois society and get beyond capitalism would be to overcome the metaphysics of labor, which up till now has been the way we've understood freedom. We've understood freedom as a metaphysics of labor. Social recognition through our labor, self-recognition through our labor, recognition of nature and our relation to nature through our labor. Capitalism points beyond that. We don't know what it will be beyond that. We just know it won't be this because this isn't working, right? So this is not a metaphysics of freedom anymore, so much as it's a metaphysics of unfreedom. And that's where people like Heidegger come in, by the way. So when we read Adorno later, and Lukács is paving the way for this, Heidegger is an authentic, to use his language, an authentic expression of the actual metaphysics of being in capitalism, which Heidegger misrecognizes as Western metaphysics going back to the ancient Greeks. Marxists say, no, what Heidegger is saying is true, but it's more historically specific than Heidegger recognizes. It's not an ancient problem of Western civilization. It's a very modern problem of capitalism. Now, again, Marx uses metaphysical language, very frankly, even though he knows, right? So why does he? Because it's appropriate. But he uses it to describe and characterize a state of unfreedom. Right. So, Marxists are anti-metaphysics? No. Marxists aren't anti-anything. Marxists have a dialectical approach to everything, including metaphysics, including philosophy itself. So it's not like an anti-philosophy or an anti-metaphysics. It's not empiricism. Like there was an anti-metaphysics, David Hume. It's not that. It's Kantian, it's Hegelian, meaning it recognizes the necessity of metaphysics, recognizes the true basis of metaphysics, but also understands that what was a description of a process of emancipation is now, at least equally, a description of the process of domination and unfreedom. Alienated labor, alienated metaphysics.